Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: not the world you know, where time is something you carry in your pocket or glance at on a screen, but a world where time carried you. A world where the measured tolling of a bell didn't just mark the hour, it commanded it. It told you when to pray, when to work, when to eat, and when to sleep. It shaped your life around rhythms you didn't choose, under the watchful eyes of powers you couldn't question. This was the reality for millions of people living in medieval Europe, where horology, the art and science of measuring time, wasn't just about mechanics. It was about control. We often think of the Middle Ages as a period defined by castles, crusades, and chivalry. But beneath those grand narratives lies a quieter, more pervasive story, one told not in battles or ballads, but in ticks and tocks. From the solemn halls of monasteries to the bustling squares of growing towns, clocks emerged as silent enforcers of order, discipline, and authority. They were tools used by kings, abbots, and guild masters to regiment society, enforce obedience, and reinforce the hierarchies that kept them in power. And what's truly remarkable is how much of that relationship with time still lingers with us today, woven into the very fabric of our modern lives. In this video, we're going to journey back to an era when time was not a personal possession, but a public instrument, one that could be mastered, manipulated, and monopolized. We'll explore how something as seemingly innocent as a clock face or a bell tower became a mechanism of social engineering, shaping everything from spiritual devotion to economic exploitation. We'll meet the people who turned time into power and those who found ways to resist it, and by the end, you may never look at the clock on your wall or the one on your phone the same way again. This is the story of the clock that told more than time. But before the steady tick of gears and the chime of bells, time was a different creature entirely. It was woven into the very world around people. The sun's arc across the sky divided the day into rough periods of light. The length of a shadow cast by a tree or a standing stone gave a more personal, local measure. The changing seasons, marked by the bloom of certain flowers or the migration of birds, dictated the rhythms of planting and harvest. This was a fluid, organic time, deeply connected to the natural world and shared by the entire community. It was a time that belonged to everyone and no one simultaneously. Then came a profound technological shift, a quiet revolution that began in the 13th century. The invention of the mechanical clock changed everything. For the first time, humanity had created a machine that could mimic the heavens, breaking the day into precise, equal, and utterly artificial units. This wasn't just a new way to tell time, it was a new way to think about time. It could now be segmented, counted, and most importantly, controlled. The authority to define time was no longer vested in the sun or the stars, but in the intricate brass and iron mechanisms built by human hands. And those hands were almost always attached to institutions of immense power. It is no surprise that the earliest adopters of this revolutionary technology were the great monasteries and cathedrals of Europe. These were large, complex communities that required strict coordination. The monastic day was already divided into the 8 canonical hours periods for prayer, like matins at night or lauds at dawn. But relying on water clocks or the unreliable sleep patterns of a designated monk was imperfect. The mechanical clock offered a solution, a reliable, automated, and authoritative voice to call the community to order. Its bell would ring out at the exact same moment every day, cutting through fog, rain, or the darkness of night, ensuring that every single monk adhered to the sacred schedule without exception. This was about far more than mere punctuality. By taking control of time, the Church was asserting its ultimate authority over the daily lives of the faithful. The clock's bell became the voice of God's order on earth, a constant auditory reminder that spiritual devotion required temporal obedience. Wasting time wasn't just inefficient, it was a sin against the divine schedule. This innovation transformed time from a shared natural resource into a managed commodity, a currency of discipline that the Church now minted and regulated. The stage was being set for this powerful tool to move beyond the monastery walls and into the heart of a changing society, where new powers were waiting to use it for their own ends. Within the secluded walls of medieval monasteries, a new kind of order was being forged, one measured not by the sun but by the steady, unwavering pulse of a machine. This was the cradle of horological control, where the regimentation of time became the very foundation of spiritual life. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries before the mechanical clock's invention, had already laid the philosophical groundwork, dividing the monk's day into a sacred sequence of prayer, manual labor, and contemplative reading known as the Opus Dei, or work of God. But enforcing this divine schedule with human accuracy was a constant challenge. Initially, monasteries relied on more primitive methods. A monk might be tasked with watching the stars or the sun's position through a specific window. Water clocks or clepsydras offered a slight improvement, using the steady drip of water to mark the passing hours. Yet these methods were flawed. Clouds could obscure the sky, water could freeze in winter, and human error was always a factor. The day's rhythm could easily fall into disarray. The arrival of the mechanical clock in the 13th century changed everything. Here was a device that could operate independently of the weather, the seasons, or a sleepy monk's attention. It promised a perfection in timekeeping that mirrored the perfect order the monastic community sought to achieve. The impact was immediate and profound. The clock's bell would ring out with mechanical certainty for the 8 canonical hours, from the pre-dawn call to matins to the final compline at night. This wasn't a gentle suggestion, it was a command. At the sound of the bell, every monk, no matter what he was doing, whether copying a manuscript in the scriptorium, tending to herbs in the garden, or in deep prayer, would immediately stop and move to the chapel. His entire existence was now synchronized to this artificial rhythm. The clock eliminated debate, hesitation, or personal interpretation. There was no longer any excuse for being late. Punctuality became the highest form of devotion, and lateness a sign of spiritual failing. But this was about far more than just organizing prayer. The clock was a powerful tool for reinforcing the monastery's strict social hierarchy. The abbot or prior who controlled the clock and interpreted its schedule solidified his authority. He was the master of time and through it the master of men. The relentless schedule left no room for idleness, which was considered the enemy of the soul, and even less room for individual thought or dissent. Every moment was accounted for, every action prescribed. The clock's chime became the audible voice of institutional authority, a constant reminder that the individual will was to be submerged entirely within the collective rhythm of the community. This created a powerful symbolism that resonated throughout medieval society. The clock was seen as a miniature model of the universe itself, its interlocking gears reflecting the perfect, harmonious order of God's creation. Just as the planets moved in their celestial spheres according to divine law, so too must the monks move in obedient harmony within the monastery. The clock's steady, predictable tick was the sound of that cosmic order imposed on earth. It made the abstract idea of divine will tangible, audible, and inescapable. The monastery, disciplined by the clock, became a living metaphor for a well-ordered soul and a well-ordered society, a concept that secular rulers would soon look upon with great interest. Yet this monastic model of temporal discipline was not destined to remain confined behind stone walls. As Europe emerged from the early Middle Ages, a new social force was rising, the bustling, noisy, and increasingly powerful medieval town. With growing populations, thriving trade networks, and a complex web of guilds and merchants, these urban centers presented a new challenge to authority. How could order be maintained in such a diverse and crowded environment? The answer, civic leaders soon realized, was hanging in the very air the townspeople breathed. It was time itself. And so, the clock began its migration from the monastic cloister to the town square, its purpose shifting subtly from spiritual obedience to civic control. The timing of this shift was no accident. The High Middle Ages, particularly the 14th and 15th centuries, saw towns across Europe gaining greater autonomy through charters granted by kings or emperors. With this newfound self-governance came the responsibility and the desire to manage daily life without constant reliance on the church. While monastery bells had long provided the auditory backdrop to existence, their schedule was tailored to the rhythm of prayer, not the hustle of commerce. Town councils, often composed of wealthy merchants and guild masters, needed a way to standardize the working day, regulate market hours, and impose curfews to prevent crime and social unrest. The public clock, mounted high on a tower for all to see and hear, became the perfect instrument for this new form of secular authority. Consider the magnificent clock installed at Salisbury Cathedral in England around 1386. While housed in a cathedral, it was a civic project funded and maintained by the town. Its great bell would have tolled not just for services, but to mark the opening of the city gates at dawn, the start and end of the market trading day, and the evening curfew when all citizens were expected to be off the streets. This was a profound shift. Time was no longer solely God's time. It was now the town's time. The sound of the bell signaled the power of the mayor and the council, reminding every merchant, apprentice, and laborer that their activities were now subject to municipal regulation. These towering timepieces were far more than mere functional machines. They were masterpieces of propaganda and civic pride. Many, like the famous astronomical clock in Prague, were adorned with moving figures known as automata. You might see wooden apostles processioning on the hour, a skeleton representing death striking the bell, or a rooster crowing to mark the time. These theatrical displays served a dual purpose. On one hand, they celebrated the town's wealth, technical sophistication, and unique identity, giving citizens a symbol to rally around. On the other hand, they delivered a subtle but powerful message. The relentless, automated movement of these figures mirrored the expected obedience of the populace. Just as the gears meshed together perfectly, so too should the different classes of urban society work in harmonious and regulated unison under the guidance of their leaders. This control over time became a crucial tool for economic management and social stability. By dictating standardized market hours, authorities could ensure fair trade and prevent disputes. A guild could mandate that all its members begin work at the same clock-struck hour, preventing any one artisan from gaining an unfair advantage by starting earlier. A uniform curfew enforced by the clock helped town watchmen maintain order after dark. In an era before professional police forces, this predictable rhythm was essential for suppressing potential unrest and creating an environment where commerce could flourish. For the urban elites who controlled these mechanisms, the clock was the ultimate administrative device, allowing them to orchestrate the complex symphony of city life, project an image of impeccable order to the outside world, and most importantly, keep the burgeoning middle and lower classes in their appointed place. The public clock tower became the undeniable heart of the medieval city, its face watching over all and its voice commanding the rhythm of thousands of lives. While the bells of the town and the monastery marked time for the devout and the merchant, an even more profound and personal transformation was occurring in the fields and workshops where the vast majority of medieval people spent their lives. For the peasantry, the arrival of mechanical time was not about spiritual order or civic pride. It was a fundamental shift in the very nature of work, a quiet revolution that replaced the rhythms of the earth with the relentless tick of the overseer's clock. This was the frontier where timekeeping became a direct tool for economic exploitation, systematically dismantling the autonomy that laborers had known for centuries. Before the clock, a peasant's day was measured in tasks, not hours. The work was done when the sun was high, and rest came when a shadow reached a certain stone. The harvest was gathered not by the clock but by the readiness of the crop and the collective effort of the community. This task-oriented time was fluid, human-scaled, and deeply connected to the natural world. A landlord might demand a certain number of days of labor from his serfs, but the definition of a day was negotiable. It was the time between sunrise and sunset, which changed with the seasons. In winter, a workday was short. In summer, it was long. This system, while still exploitative, had a built-in flexibility and a recognition of natural limits. The mechanical clock shattered this ancient understanding. Suddenly, a day's work could be redefined as a fixed number of hours, measured with a new and unforgiving precision. Manorial courts, which settled disputes between lords and tenants, began to hear cases that hinged on these new units of time. Where a peasant might have once argued that he had worked from sunup to sundown, he now faced a landlord's steward pointing to a clock, insisting that a specific number of hours were owed regardless of the season or the weather. This wasn't just a change in measurement. It was a legal and philosophical shift that privileged the abstract unit of the hour over the completed task or the natural cycle. The crowing rooster was no longer a valid witness in court. The silent, ticking clock was. This new precision became a powerful lever for extracting more labor. Overseers, now armed with the authority of clock time, could monitor breaks with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that a rest period didn't stretch a moment too long. In workshops controlled by guilds, apprentices and journeymen found their days divided into strictly enforced segments for work, meals, and sleep. The clock hanging on the wall was no mere decoration. It was a silent foreman, a constant reminder that every moment had a monetary value for the master, and that any moment not spent in productive labor was a moment stolen. This increased surveillance eroded the small pockets of autonomy and camaraderie that workers had previously enjoyed, replacing them with a constant, low-level anxiety about productivity. The ultimate effect was to bind the laborer more tightly than ever to the emerging capitalist economy. Work was increasingly divorced from its purpose and became simply a quantity of time sold to an employer. The peasant who once worked to fill his own family's larder was now working to fill a set number of hours for a wage that often felt insufficient. This disempowerment was a crucial step in creating a landless working class, a population dependent on selling their time to survive. The clock, in this grim context, was the perfect machine for this new economic order. Its gears meshed seamlessly with the gears of capital, grinding out profit by segmenting human life into manageable, measurable, and ultimately purchasable units. It became the heartbeat of a system where time was no longer lived but spent, and where the value of a person was increasingly reduced to the hours they could sell. This integration of time and theology ensured that the clock was far more than a scheduling tool. It was a constant, inescapable sermon. For a population largely unable to read the written word, these mechanical marvels became a primary text, their faces a Bible in brass and iron. A common feature was the depiction of the Last Judgment, with figures of the saved rising to heaven and the damned being dragged down to hell by demons, a stark visual warning that every passing hour brought one closer to this final reckoning. Other clocks showed the Dance of Death, a popular medieval allegory where a skeleton representing death leads people from all walks of life, popes, emperors, peasants, in a macabre dance toward the grave. This was a powerful equalizer, a reminder that time spares no one, and that earthly status meant nothing in the face of divine eternity. The auditory component was equally potent. The bell's toll was not a neutral sound. It was considered the voice of the church itself, a sacred instrument that could pierce the noise of daily life to reach the soul of every listener. Its regular, solemn peals for the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, and so on did more than just announce a prayer time. They created a sonic landscape of devotion, a rhythm that structured the entire day around moments of spiritual reflection. To ignore this call was not merely to be late, it was to willfully turn away from God's appointed schedule, making punctuality a direct measure of one's faith and obedience. In this way, the very concept of wasting time was transformed from a practical concern into a mortal sin, a failure to use God's most precious gift for its intended holy purpose. This fusion of mechanics and morality allowed the Church to extend its reach into the most intimate corners of human consciousness. The clock made abstract religious concepts tangible and immediate. The idea of divine judgment was no longer a distant event at the end of the world but a present reality, visually reinforced with every glance at the clock face and audibly marked with every strike of the bell. This constant reinforcement served to naturalize the Church's authority, making its control over daily life seem as inevitable and righteous as the passage of time itself. The clock became a physical manifestation of the divine order, and by obeying its rhythm, the faithful were not just following a schedule but participating in a cosmic plan directed by ecclesiastical power. This sanctification of artificial time had a profound effect on medieval spirituality. It internalized a new form of discipline, where individuals began to police their own use of time according to these religious principles. The anxiety over using time wisely, a concept we still grapple with today, finds one of its earliest origins in this period. The clock's relentless motion served as a perpetual memento mori, a reminder of one's own mortality and the fleeting nature of earthly pursuits. This was not meant to inspire despair but to encourage a life of piety and purpose, channeled through the strictures of the Church. By making time sacred, the Church ensured that its management was also a sacred duty, one that it alone was qualified to oversee, thus cementing its role as the essential intermediary between humanity and the divine. If the monastery demonstrated time's power over the soul and the town square showcased its authority over commerce, then the royal court revealed its ultimate purpose, the projection of raw political power. Kings and feudal lords, always alert to new tools for consolidating their authority, were quick to recognize the potent symbolism of the mechanical clock. This was not a device to be hidden away in a tower for public use. It was a masterpiece to be displayed in palace halls, a glittering testament to a ruler's wealth, technological mastery, and divine right to govern the very hours of the day. These royal timepieces were engineering marvels and artistic triumphs, designed to inspire awe and submission. Consider the clock commissioned by King Charles V of France in the 1400s for his palace in Paris. It was more than a timekeeper. It was a complex astronomical instrument and an automaton theater, showing the movements of the planets and featuring figures that moved on the hour. A clock like this was a statement. It proclaimed that the king was not merely a political leader but a master of the cosmos, a man whose court could harness the laws of nature itself. Owning such a sophisticated machine placed a monarch at the pinnacle of European sophistication, suggesting that his wisdom and control were as precise and reliable as the mechanism itself. It was a form of soft power, impressing foreign ambassadors and intimidating rival nobles without a single word being spoken. This symbolic power was often exchanged directly through diplomacy. An elaborate clock was a coveted diplomatic gift, a physical token of alliance and respect between rulers. To present another monarch with a magnificent clock was to acknowledge his power and place within the feudal hierarchy, while simultaneously showcasing your own kingdom's superior artisans and engineers. Receiving such a gift created an obligation, binding the recipient in a relationship where the giver was subtly framed as the more advanced and powerful patron. These exchanges wove a web of temporal symbolism across Europe, with clocks standing as silent sentinels in countless castles, each one a reminder of the political bonds and power dynamics that structured the medieval world. Yet beyond this glittering symbolism lay a more insidious and psychological application of horological control. The scheduling of court life itself became a refined tool for asserting dominance. A king's day was meticulously choreographed by the palace clock, from his lever, the ceremonial waking, to his coucher or bedtime. Access to the monarch during these periods was a prized commodity, a sign of royal favor that nobles would fiercely compete for. The clock governed this entire economy of access. A courtier summoned for an audience at a specific hour would often be made to wait, sometimes for hours on end, in antechambers and hallways. This deliberate delay was not a matter of poor organization. It was a calculated power play. Making powerful nobles wait was a masterstroke of political theater. It demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that the king's time was infinitely more valuable than theirs. Their time was subject to his whims, his time was sovereign. This enforced idleness humbled even the most prideful duke or count, reducing them to passive subjects whose schedules were utterly disposable. The constant, audible ticking of the court clock during this wait would have deepened the psychological effect, each passing second a tiny hammer blow to their sense of self-importance and a reinforcement of the monarch's absolute control. In this environment, punctuality became a form of fealty. To be on time for the king was to acknowledge his authority. To be late was an act of profound disrespect, potentially bordering on treason. This intricate dance of schedules and waiting periods allowed the clock to become the perfect metaphor for the state itself. The king was the prime mover, the mainspring from which all power and order flowed. His courtiers and subjects were the intricate gears and weights, each with a designated function, all moving in synchronized obedience to his will. The well-ordered state, like a well-made clock, was meant to run smoothly, predictably, and hierarchically, with every component accepting its place in the greater machine. The genius of this metaphor was that it naturalized authoritarian rule. It suggested that the king's power was not a violent imposition but a natural, mechanical, and even beautiful necessity for a functioning society. Just as one would not question the purpose of a gear in a clock, one should not question one's place in the social order. The political clock thus did more than tell time. It told people their place, legitimizing a system where time, and therefore life itself, was a resource to be managed from the throne downward. This meticulous control over time was about far more than just keeping a tidy schedule. It was the very bedrock of the guild's economic power and its ability to enforce a monopoly. By synchronizing the entire membership, the guild could present a united front to the outside world, preventing any single master from undercutting others by working longer hours for lower prices. This collective discipline was essential for maintaining high standards of quality, which were the lifeblood of a guild's reputation. A clock-regulated workday ensured that a journeyman couldn't rush a piece of furniture or a piece of cloth, sacrificing craftsmanship for speed. The time allotted for each task was calibrated to produce work that met the guild's exacting specifications, protecting the value of their brand and justifying the higher prices they could command. This system also served as a powerful tool for policing the labor force and settling the inevitable disputes that arose in crowded workshops. If an apprentice claimed he had been forced to work beyond the regulated hours, the guild clock provided an impartial arbiter. Conversely, a master could point to the clock to prove a journeyman had taken an overly long break or had been late starting a crucial task. This introduced a new, impersonal form of evidence into labor relations, one that was harder to dispute than a person's word against another's. It shifted arguments from subjective claims about effort to objective measurements of time, further cementing the clock's authority as the ultimate judge in the workshop. The guild's temporal authority didn't stop at the door of the workshop. It extended out into the bustling heart of medieval commerce, the marketplace, and the annual fair. Here, the public clock tower became the great regulator of trade. Its bell would signal the precise moment the market gates opened, preventing early birds from gaining an unfair advantage. It would toll to mark the beginning and end of official trading hours, after which no transactions could legally take place. This prevented the fraud and chaos that could flourish in the dim light of dawn or dusk, protecting both buyers and legitimate sellers. At a large fair, the clock might even govern the opening of different sections, perhaps the cloth market at 1 hour, and the spice merchants at the next, orchestrating the complex event with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. In this way, the medieval guild used the clock to perform a delicate balancing act. On one hand, it fostered a spirit of cooperation and mutual protection among its members, ensuring a level playing field and a dignified livelihood for all. This was the benevolent side of the guild, the precursor to the union's ideals of solidarity. On the other hand, it was a ruthless instrument of control and exclusion. It limited output to keep prices high, restricted the number of masters to prevent competition, and used the regimentation of time to crush individual initiative and discipline any member who stepped out of line. The clock was the perfect mechanism for this dual purpose, its face presenting an image of impartial order while its gears quietly turned to enforce the strict economic rules that protected the guild's privileged position in a rapidly changing world. But this authority wasn't just asserted through sound and symbolism. It was literally built into the gears and mechanisms of the clocks themselves. The intricate brass and ironwork of a medieval timepiece was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a physical manifestation of the very principles of control it was designed to enforce. Every component, from the massive driving weights to the finely toothed gears, worked in a strict, unyielding hierarchy. The main gear, or the great wheel, drove smaller gears, which in turn drove others, each with a specific, subordinate function. This mirrored the feudal structure perfectly. A single source of power, be it a king, an abbot, or a guildmaster, dictating the motion of every smaller part in the societal machine. There was no room for improvisation or individual will in the clock's operation. Every element had to mesh perfectly with the others, moving in lockstep, or the entire system would fail. A clock was a microcosm of the ideal, obedient society its creators wished to build. The key to this new level of control was a critical invention, the verge and foliot escapement. Before this mechanism, timekeeping devices like water clocks were notoriously inaccurate and inconsistent, losing or gaining hours over the course of a day. The escapement changed everything. It acted as the brain of the clock, a clever regulator that transformed the continuous, crashing force of the descending weights into a steady, measured series of ticks and tocks. The foliot, a horizontal bar with adjustable weights, would rock back and forth, and with each swing, the verge would release the gear train to advance by one tooth. This created a rhythm that was far more reliable than anything that had come before. This newfound accuracy was the foundation of enforcement. You cannot demand punctuality to the minute if your timepiece is unreliable. The escapement provided a consistent, objective standard against which everyone's actions could be judged, making the clock's authority seem not just powerful but fair and impartial, a far more persuasive form of control. The men who built these machines were not independent artists, but were almost always directly employed by the very institutions that sought to wield this power. A master clockmaker was typically on the payroll of a cathedral chapter, a wealthy town council, or a royal court. His patrons' needs dictated the design. This meant the mechanisms were often built with security in mind. The clockworks were housed in massive, locked iron cases, often located in a room high in a tower that was inaccessible to the public. The complex gearing and adjustment mechanisms were a mystery to all but a chosen few, ensuring that the flow of time could not be easily tampered with or altered by disgruntled citizens or rebellious workers. The authority to define time was not just proclaimed, it was physically protected, locked away behind doors and secrets, making the official time a truth that could only be dispensed from above, never questioned from below. This physical inaccessibility was paired with a very public presence. The clocks were mounted in the highest towers, making their faces visible from every corner of the town square, and their bells audible for miles into the surrounding countryside. This was a brilliant strategy. The clock was omnipresent, an ever-watchful eye and an ever-listening ear for authority. You could not escape its judgment. At the same time, its mechanical heart remained remote and mysterious, high above the crowd. This combination of public output and private mechanism created a powerful dependency. The entire community relied on the clock for the structure of their day, yet only the designated experts, the clockmakers, and the authorities who employed them possessed the knowledge to maintain and interpret it. This made the populace perpetually reliant on those in power, reinforcing the social order with every toll of the bell. The clock tower became a literal lighthouse of control, its signal guiding everyone's actions while its inner workings remained shrouded in impenetrable fog. Ultimately, the medieval clock was a perfect paradox, a machine of breathtaking ingenuity and beauty that served as an instrument of profound social regulation. Its gears did more than count minutes, they ground out conformity. Its chimes did more than mark hours, they signaled submission. Every tick was a tiny hammer blow against individual autonomy, and every tock was a reminder that time itself, the most fundamental experience of human life, was now a commodity owned and operated by the powers that be. This sophisticated technology turned the abstract concept of authority into something tangible, audible, and inescapable, weaving it into the daily rhythm of existence until it felt less like oppression and more like the natural order of the world. This growing divide in timekeeping technology created a starkly different daily reality depending on one's place in the social hierarchy. For the elite, the nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking clergy, time was becoming a private possession. They began to acquire exquisite personal timepieces like ornate table clocks for their studies or finely crafted pocket sundials. These were more than mere instruments. They were jewels of technology, status symbols that proclaimed the owner's refinement and, most importantly, their autonomy. A lord with a table clock in his solar could arrange his day as he saw fit. He could schedule a private meeting, dedicate an hour to correspondence, or simply choose to read for pleasure, all according to his own private measure of time. This control over one's schedule was a profound form of power, a declaration of independence from the public rhythm that governed everyone else. It meant his time was his own to spend, waste, or invest as he pleased, a luxury that was utterly unimaginable to the vast majority of the population. For the laboring classes, the experience was the complete opposite. Their lives were tethered to the public time signal, a dependency that made them extraordinarily vulnerable to regulation. The start of their workday was not a personal choice, but a moment dictated by the distant tolling of a bell from a tower they could not enter. Their lunch break ended not when they felt ready, but when the clock's hands reached a position they could not see. This reliance on an external, authoritative signal stripped them of any agency over the pace and structure of their own day. A field hand might be working under the blazing noon sun, desperate for a moment's rest and a drink of water, but if the bell had not yet sounded, that respite was officially forbidden. Their bodies and their needs were subservient to the impersonal, mechanical rhythm of a machine controlled by their social superiors. This disparity turned the clock itself into one of the most potent status symbols of the late medieval period. To own a timepiece was to visually announce that you were a person of importance, someone whose commitments were so valuable they required private measurement. It signaled that you were a manager of time, not a subject of it. Conversely, to lack one was to be publicly marked as someone whose time was not their own, a person whose hours were a resource to be managed by others for their profit. This was a powerful reinforcement of the existing feudal order, providing a new technological justification for class divisions. It wasn't just that the wealthy had more money and land. They were now shown to possess a more refined and sophisticated relationship with time itself, the very fabric of existence. This created a perception that their superior social position was somehow natural, even logical, because they could master something as abstract and universal as time. The ultimate effect was to create a society where time itself was a commodity distributed unequally. The wealthy could buy precision and autonomy, purchasing back control over their own lives from the public sphere. The poor, however, could only rent their time, selling it in bulk to landlords and guild masters who used the public clock to measure every minute they had purchased. This made the laboring classes perpetually susceptible to exploitation, as they had no independent means to verify the time claims of their employers. If an overseer declared that the workday had started late according to the town clock, who could argue? The clock's word was final. This technological imbalance locked in economic and social inequality, ensuring that the power to define time, and therefore the value of a person's labor and life, remained firmly in the hands of the very people who benefited most from its careful control. Yet even as the gears of authority turned with relentless precision, the human spirit proved it was not so easily regulated. The imposition of mechanical time, for all its power, was never a complete victory. In the shadows of the great clock towers and beneath the sound of their commanding bells, ordinary people engaged in a quiet, persistent campaign of resistance, finding ingenious ways to carve out pockets of autonomy and reclaim a sense of time that felt truly their own. This was not the stuff of grand rebellions or dramatic manifestos, but a subtle, everyday subversion practiced in fields, workshops, and homes across Europe. One of the most common forms of defiance was simply the deliberate, strategic slowdown. Workers who were now monitored by the hour quickly learned that while a master could measure the time they spent at a task, he could not as easily measure the intensity of their effort within that time. The phrase "to work by the clock" took on a double meaning. It meant to work until the bell rang, but also to work at a pace dictated by the worker, not the machine. A group of laborers might agree among themselves to a certain unhurried rhythm, a silent consensus that limited output and preserved their energy. This was a way of sabotaging the very productivity the clock was meant to enforce. turning the ruler's own tool against him by adhering to the letter of the law while subverting its spirit. Feigning ignorance was another powerful tactic. A peasant might claim to have misheard the bell due to the wind, or an apprentice could plead confusion over the complex chiming of the canonical hours, thus creating a plausible excuse for a late start or an early departure. Beyond these individual acts, entire communities preserved alternative temporal rhythms that operated in a parallel world to the official clock time. Village festivals, often rooted in ancient pagan traditions, followed their own schedules based on the agricultural cycle or the phases of the moon. These events, a harvest home celebration, a May Day gathering, a midwinter feast, created temporal bubbles where the normal rules were suspended. During these festivals, the official clock time was irrelevant. The celebration lasted as long as the community willed it, often to the chagrin of local priests and officials who saw them as wasteful and disorderly. The carnivalesque atmosphere of these events, where social hierarchies were often temporarily inverted, was a direct challenge to the imposed order that the clock represented. It was a way of saying that some times were not for work and discipline, but for community, laughter, and a different kind of sacredness. This cultural resistance found its voice in folk tales and songs that circulated in taverns and around hearths. The character of the lazy but clever peasant who consistently outwits his strict clock-watching master became a beloved archetype. In these stories, the hero's victory comes not through hard work as defined by the landlord, but through cunning, luck, and a deep connection to the natural world. He knows precisely when the fish are biting or when the sun is at its warmest for a nap, and he uses this knowledge to avoid the pointless labor demanded by his superior. These narratives served a crucial purpose. They provided a psychological release valve and offered a model for defiance, celebrating a wisdom that was intuitive and human over one that was mechanical and imposed. They kept alive the idea that there were other, valid ways to experience time. These myriad acts of resistance, from the slowed pace to the subversive festival, reveal a crucial truth about the medieval world. The authority of the clock, while immense, was always contested. It was a constant negotiation, not a monolith. People pushed back against the tyranny of the bell in whatever small ways they could, preserving a sense of agency over their own lives and labor. This history reminds us that technologies of control are rarely as total as they seem. Even in the most rigid systems, human creativity and the desire for freedom find a way to seep through the cracks, insisting that time should also be for living, not just for being managed. This march of mechanical time across the continent was anything but uniform, a patchwork of adoption that reflected the deep political and cultural fractures of medieval Europe. The clock did not spread like a wave. It was planted, a deliberate import by those in power who recognized its potential to solidify their rule. Where you stood on the map profoundly shaped when you heard that first, authoritative chime and what it specifically meant for your life. In the bustling, profit-driven city-states of northern Italy, the purpose of the clock was fundamentally economic. Venice, the Serene Republic, was a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea, and its vast wealth depended on the precise coordination of maritime trade. The great clock in the Piazza San Marco, adorned with its iconic Moors striking the bell, was far more than a tourist attraction. It was the regulator of the entire Venetian economy. Its bells signaled the opening and closing of the Rialto market, the arrival and departure of the merchant galleys in the lagoon, and the hours when the banking houses, the lifeblood of European finance, would conduct their business. Here, time was money in the most literal sense. Contracts for future deliveries of spices or silk included precise time clauses, and interest on loans was calculated to the day. The clock introduced a new, unforgiving element to commerce, the deadline. This temporal precision became woven directly into Venetian commercial law, creating a legal framework where punctuality was not just expected but legally enforceable, making the state the ultimate guarantor of timed agreements. Just to the north, in Florence, the clock served a similar purpose for a different master, the powerful wool and banking guilds that effectively ruled the Republic. The Florentine calendar itself was unique, beginning the new year not on January 1st but on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, aligning the fiscal year with the agricultural and business cycles. The public clocks installed in guild halls and church towers enforced a strict rhythm on the thousands of workers in the textile trade. Dyers, weavers, and finishers all had their labor segmented into clock-measured units, ensuring a standardized output that could be managed for maximum profit. The clock allowed the wealthy popolo grasso, the fat people, to micromanage the productivity of the popolo minuto, the little people, from a distance. In the Italian context, the clock was the engine of nascent capitalism, a tool for rationalizing and intensifying economic exploitation long before the Industrial Revolution. A very different story unfolded in England, where the clock's arrival was tied directly to a project of brutal state building, the Norman Conquest. Following his victory in 1066, William the Conqueror faced the immense task of subduing and governing a hostile population. The Normans were masters of administration and control, and they imported clock technology as part of a broader package of feudal consolidation. The imposing stone keeps of Norman castles, symbols of military domination, often housed early clocks that helped regiment the garrison's schedule for guard changes, drills, and patrols. This was timekeeping in the service of military occupation. As the English state gradually centralized under subsequent monarchs, the use of clocks expanded. Royal courts and administrative centers adopted them to schedule the endless rounds of petitions, court sessions, and tax collections that were the arteries of royal power. The clock helped transform a fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdom into a more unified, top-down state where the king's time, the time of the law and the tax collector, was increasingly imposed on every shire and town. Meanwhile, in the vast expanses of Eastern Europe and the Slavic kingdoms, the adoption of mechanical time was a slower, more gradual process, often lagging a century or more behind the West. The region's more dispersed population, weaker urban centers, and persistent patterns of serfdom meant there was less immediate need for the precise public timekeeping that bustling Italian towns required. When clocks did finally appear, their purpose often hewed closer to the original monastic model, but in a feudal context. In regions like Poland and Hungary, it was the great landed aristocracy, the magnates, who commissioned clocks for their fortified manor houses and estate churches. For them, the clock was a symbol of their enlightened status and a practical tool for managing their extensive landed estates and the legions of serfs who worked them. The bell from the manor clock replaced the older, more informal signals, regimenting the agricultural workday with a new precision that benefited the landlord. Its chime across the fields was a sonic claim to ownership, not just of the land, but of the very time of the people who lived on it. This delayed adoption shows that the clock was not an inevitable technological progress. It was a technology of control that arrived precisely when and where local power structures were ready to wield it. While the tolling of the town bell regimented the labor of men in the fields and workshops, the chimes of the clock penetrated the very heart of the home, where medieval women experienced time discipline in uniquely gendered and often invisible ways. The household was not a refuge from the clock's authority. It was a primary site of its enforcement, and women were both its primary subjects and, intriguingly, its on-the-ground managers. A noblewoman in her manor house or a burgher's wife in a burgeoning town was expected to be the timekeeper for her entire domestic sphere. Her day became a meticulously scheduled performance, orchestrated by the distant bells of the monastery or town clock. She was responsible for ensuring that meals were prepared and served precisely at the appointed hours, that children were dressed and ready for prayers or lessons, and that the countless tasks of managing a household, from brewing to weaving to overseeing servants, adhered to a rigid timetable. In this way, women were made to internalize the discipline of the clock, becoming the agents of its control within the private sphere, while simultaneously being its most closely monitored subjects. Their worth as wives and mothers became implicitly tied to their ability to maintain this punishing schedule, a form of unpaid labor that was both expected and largely unseen. This pressure for temporal obedience reached an even more intense pitch within the walls of nunneries. If monastic life for men was a regimented pursuit of God, for women it was often a fortress of enforced piety and surveillance. Nunneries frequently adopted even stricter horological regimes than their male counterparts, a reflection of the broader societal obsession with controlling female virtue and behavior. The canonical hours were observed with relentless precision, and the moments between prayers were filled with scheduled labor-copying manuscripts, creating liturgical textiles, or tending herb gardens, all measured by the clock. The abbess or prioress, herself under the scrutiny of male ecclesiastical authorities, used the clock to demonstrate her community's perfect discipline and orthodoxy, leaving no room for accusations of idleness or moral laxity. For these religious women, the clock was a double-edged sword. It provided a structure for a life of profound spiritual devotion, but it also served as a constant mechanical guardian, ensuring they remained within the narrowly prescribed boundaries of acceptable female conduct. Yet, in a fascinating contradiction to this narrative of control, a handful of women managed to not only navigate this rigid temporal world, but to shape the technology itself. Though their stories are sparse and often overlooked by historical records, women did contribute to the art and science of horology. Some were the wives or daughters of master clockmakers, learning the craft within the family workshop and occasionally taking over the business upon a father's or husband's death. Others, particularly in affluent convents, applied their intellectual and artistic skills to the maintenance and even design of intricate clockwork mechanisms for astronomical clocks or elaborate automata. While their names are largely lost to us, their legacy is a testament to quiet resilience. These rare female clockmakers and inventors subtly challenged the male-dominated narrative that technology was solely an instrument of control wielded over women. They demonstrated that it could also be a medium for female creativity, intellect, and agency, a tool they could understand, repair, and even improve upon. The clock's impact on medieval women thus presents a complex portrait of constraint and subtle resistance. For the vast majority, it meant their lives were circumscribed by a web of temporal obligations that reinforced their prescribed social roles as dutiful housekeepers, pious devotees, and obedient daughters. The technology that promised order to society often delivered a multiplied burden of responsibility to them, making their labor more visible to authority figures while rendering its sheer volume even more invisible as simply women's work. Yet, even within this rigid framework, women found ways to exert influence. The mistress of a household might use the schedule to carve out small, precious moments for herself, perhaps for private prayer or correspondence. A nun might find deep, authentic meaning in the rhythmic liturgy of the hours, transcending the enforcement to achieve genuine spiritual fulfillment. And those few who touched the gears and springs themselves proved that the mastery of time was not an exclusively male dominion. The history of women and the medieval clock is not a simple story of oppression but a nuanced negotiation, revealing how one of history's most powerful technologies intersected with the equally powerful forces of gender, duty, and the quiet, persistent search for autonomy. This new relationship with time, measured in precise, artificial units, began to rewire the human mind itself. For the first time, people started to feel the peculiar weight of the hour, the minute, the moment that was slipping away unproductively. A deep-seated anxiety began to take root, a quiet dread that one was not using time correctly or efficiently enough. This was a profound shift from the task-oriented mindset of the past, where a day was successful if the field was plowed or the cloth was woven, regardless of how long it took. Now, the value of one's labor, and by extension, one's worth, was increasingly judged by the clock's impartial, unforgiving measure. The peasant in the field, the apprentice at the bench, even the housewife managing her chores, all now worked under the invisible, ever-present gaze of authority symbolized by that distant ticking. The fear of being late, of missing a deadline set by the manor court or the guild master, introduced a new form of social stress, a low hum of worry that one's life was perpetually falling behind an official schedule. Yet, for all the anxiety it generated, the mechanical clock also offered a powerful and seductive sense of order. In a world often defined by violence, disease, and the cruel unpredictability of nature, the clock's relentless, predictable rhythm provided a comforting anchor. Its chimes cut through the chaos of daily life, offering moments of certainty in an uncertain existence. Knowing that prime would come at the same time tomorrow, that the market gates would open precisely at the sound of the bell, that the working day would end at a predictable hour, this regularity created a framework of security. It made the vast, often frightening world feel more manageable and comprehensible. For many, this predictability was not a burden but a blessing, a way to impose personal and communal structure on a life that could otherwise feel random and hostile. This appeal to the human craving for stability was the genius of horological control. It made compliance feel less like forced obedience and more like a rational choice for a safer, more orderly life. This duality, the clock as both a source of stress and a provider of security, is what made it such an exceptionally effective tool for social engineering. It expertly manipulated fundamental human emotions, offering the comfort of structure while simultaneously activating the fear of chaos. Authorities could present themselves not as tyrants imposing their will, but as benevolent providers of order and predictability, the guardians of the clock that kept societal chaos at bay. This made the underlying system of control remarkably resilient and difficult to challenge. To rebel against the clock was not just to defy a king or a bishop, it was to seemingly embrace disorder, to risk plunging oneself and one's community back into the terrifying unpredictability of a timeless world. The clock's authority was thus internalized, moving from an external demand into an internal compass. People began to police their own use of time, feeling guilt for moments of idleness and pride in their own punctuality, long before any overseer could chastise them. This internalization marked a critical turning point in the history of human consciousness. The medieval mind was gradually being retrained to think in abstract, quantified segments of duration, to value precision over completion, and to see life itself as a series of appointments to be kept. The clock was forging a new kind of person, the time-conscious individual, a precursor to the modern, scheduled self. This psychological shift would prove to be one of the Middle Ages' most enduring legacies, laying the mental groundwork for the scientific revolution, the industrial age, and our own contemporary obsession with productivity and time management. The gears of the clock were not just turning in the tower, they were turning in the minds of men and women, quietly shaping a new way of being in the world, one measured tick at a time. The clock's power was not merely proclaimed, it was physically carved into the very skyline of medieval Europe, an indelible part of the architectural landscape that one could not escape. These timekeeping instruments were not added as afterthoughts but were central to the design of the most important structures in any community. The soaring spire of a cathedral, the imposing bulk of a castle keep, the grand facade of a town hall, these were the chosen pedestals for the public clock, ensuring its face and its voice would preside over every aspect of daily life. From these elevated perches, the clock's domain was absolute. A farmer tending his fields miles from the town walls would still hear the faint, carrying toll of the bell marking the noon hour. A merchant in his shop, a woman drawing water at the well, children playing in a narrow street, all lived their lives within the clock's field of vision, its hands perpetually tracing the arc of their obedience. This architectural integration made official time a constant, environmental fact, as natural and unquestionable as the rising sun or the changing seasons, yet entirely man-made and controlled. The construction of these monumental clock towers was itself a fascinating and often contradictory process. Erecting such a massive stone structure, housing a complex and expensive iron mechanism, required significant communal effort and investment. Townspeople would often contribute through taxes or even direct labor, hauling stone and timber alongside skilled masons. This created a powerful sense of collective ownership and civic pride. The clock tower was their tower, a symbol of the town's wealth and importance. Yet, this very communal effort served to reinforce the authority of the ruling elite. The mayor and council who commissioned the tower were the ones who would ultimately control the clock's schedule, using the people's own investment to better regulate their lives. The collective project created a powerful illusion of shared interest, masking the fact that the primary beneficiary of this magnificent timepiece was the existing power structure. The clock, paid for by the many, was ultimately a tool for the few. Beyond their height, the clocks were designed to captivate and command attention through artistry and spectacle. The clock face itself was a massive public canvas, often gilded and painted with elaborate designs, zodiac signs, or moral allegories. But the true marvels were the automata, the mechanical figures that sprang to life on the hour. In the Czech town of Olomouc, for instance, a clock features a procession of saints. In Wells Cathedral in England, jousting knights thunder forth on a track. These were not just whimsical decorations, they were calculated displays of technological mastery and ideological messaging. The moving figures transformed the clock from a simple time teller into a piece of theatrical propaganda. It entertained the masses, yes, but it also stunned them into a state of awe. If their leaders could command such magical feats of engineering, then surely their authority over lesser things, like the hours of the working day, was natural and justified. The clock tower became a daily source of wonder that reinforced wonderment at the power that built it. This strategic placement, woven into the very fabric of the built environment, had a profound psychological effect, naturalizing the authority of the clock and, by extension, the powers behind it. Because the timepiece was embedded in structures that were also centers of religion, governance, and defense, its authority borrowed from the inherent respect and fear those institutions commanded. The time told by the cathedral clock was God's time. The time announced from the town hall was the law's time. The time measured from the castle keep was the Lord's time. This fusion made questioning the clock's schedule akin to questioning the church, the state, or the feudal order itself, an unthinkable act for most. The clock's message was not delivered as a command but as a fact of life, as permanent and solid as the stone that housed it. This architectural embodiment of power ensured that control over time was not seen as an imposition but as an intrinsic, unchallengeable part of the medieval world, a rhythm as fundamental as a heartbeat. This new precision in timekeeping did not remain confined to workshops and market squares. It soon found a powerful and lasting home within the halls of justice itself. The medieval legal system, once a chaotic tapestry of local customs and oral testimony, began to be rewoven with the steady, unyielding thread of clock time, transforming the very nature of law and order. Imagine a courtroom before this shift, a place where proceedings might start whenever the judge arrived, where witness testimonies were anchored to vague recollections like around midday or after the morning mass, and where the concept of a deadline was as fluid as the weather. The introduction of the mechanical clock brought a revolutionary change. It made time itself a measurable, admissible fact in the pursuit of justice. Court sessions were among the first aspects of legal life to be regimented by the clock. Town halls and courthouses, often sharing a building or a square with the public clock tower, would strictly adhere to its authority. A court might be declared in session precisely at 9 in the morning, its opening marked by a bailiff or a clerk referencing the official time. This imposed a new discipline on all participants. Judges, clerks, lawyers, plaintiffs, and defendants were all now expected to conform to this schedule. Latecomers could find their cases dismissed or their testimonies disregarded, a harsh penalty that placed a new premium on punctuality. The clock's chime from outside the window became the gavel of temporal authority, its sound signaling the immutable boundaries within which justice would be administered. This standardization helped to streamline legal bureaucracy, allowing courts to process more cases with a new, mechanical efficiency that prioritized the clock's rhythm over human convenience. Perhaps the most significant legal innovation was the rise of time-bound clauses in contracts and official documents. As mechanical time became more reliable, it created a new framework for trust and obligation in business and law. A lease for a piece of farmland might now specify that the rent was due on the feast of St. Michael, but by the noon bell, introducing a precise moment for payment that prevented disputes. A contract between two merchants for the delivery of goods could include a penalty clause if the shipment arrived after a specified date and hour, a provision that was now legally enforceable because both parties could refer to the same public time standard. This was a monumental shift from an economy based on trust and personal honor to one governed by impersonal, measurable deadlines. The law now recognized and protected these temporal agreements, making the clock a silent third party to every deal, its impartial ticking the final arbiter of fulfillment or breach. This move toward temporal precision was a double-edged sword for the medieval concept of justice. On one hand, it made the law more predictable and centralized. By reducing reliance on variable local customs or the flawed memories of individuals, it created a more uniform legal landscape across a kingdom. A day in a royal court in London now meant the same 24 hours as it did in a provincial town, strengthening the Crown's authority and creating a common standard that everyone, in theory, could understand. This was a crucial step in the development of the modern state, as a centralized legal system is impossible without a standardized way to measure the passage of events. However, this new rigidity also made justice more inaccessible and intimidating for the common person. The legal system became a maze with temporal traps. A peasant who could not read a clock face and whose life was still attuned to the sun and the seasons was at a severe disadvantage. He might miss a critical court appearance because his understanding of midday was the sun at its zenith, while the judge's was the clock striking 12. The complex, time-based language of new legal documents could be manipulated by literate officials and wealthy landowners to entrap the unwary. Justice was no longer just about who had the better claim or the more truthful story. It was also about who could successfully navigate the new, artificial temporal demands of the system. The clock, in this context, became a powerful tool for those who already held power: the educated, the wealthy, and the urban elite, to further consolidate their advantage over the poor and the rural population. In this way, the clock was seamlessly integrated into the machinery of enforcement. Its authority was borrowed by the court, making the law's judgments seem as inevitable and objective as the passage of time itself. A prisoner's sentence was no longer a vague period of confinement, but a specific number of days, months, or years, meticulously counted off by the same mechanism that governed the court that had condemned him. The clock ensured that time itself was now on the side of established authority, its relentless, impartial progress giving a veneer of natural legitimacy to the sometimes arbitrary decisions of human judges. It transformed the law from a human endeavor into a process that appeared to run with the cold, automated certainty of a well-made machine, leaving little room for the mercy, flexibility, or understanding that had sometimes tempered justice in a less regimented age. This new temporal discipline soon permeated the very institutions designed to shape young minds, as schools and universities became crucibles for forging a new relationship with time. The medieval classroom, particularly within cathedral schools and the burgeoning universities of cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, began to operate with a precision that would have been familiar to any Benedictine monk. The academic day was meticulously carved into distinct segments by the insistent voice of the clock or bell, creating a rigid schedule of lectures, disputations, private study, and mandated recreation. A student's life was no longer governed by the natural rhythm of daylight or personal curiosity, but by the artificial and unforgiving divisions of the horarium, the official daily schedule. This regimentation was presented as a virtue, a necessary structure to curb the idleness and waywardness thought inherent in youth, and to instill the mental habits required for a life of service and duty. The primary goal of this system was to produce a certain type of individual, one who was punctual, diligent, and obedient to external authority. The constant reinforcement of the schedule taught students that their time was not their own to waste on frivolous pursuits, but a resource to be invested in prescribed activities for a future payoff. A scholar who arrived late to a lecture might be fined or denied entry, a tangible penalty that equated lateness with a form of moral and financial failure. This constant training in time obedience was a direct preparation for the roles these young men, for they were almost exclusively men, were expected to assume. Whether destined for the priesthood, royal bureaucracy, or a merchant guild, their future success would depend on their ability to adhere to the schedules of their superiors, to meet deadlines for sermons, tax collections, or commercial contracts. The university clock was a training ground, conditioning the elite of tomorrow to accept temporal discipline as a natural and unquestionable part of a well-ordered life. Beyond shaping behavior, the clock's presence in these centers of learning subtly transmitted a powerful philosophical message about the nature of knowledge itself. The free, meandering pursuit of wisdom, the kind associated with ancient philosophers or solitary scholars, was increasingly supplanted by an organized, compartmentalized, and controlled approach to education. The curriculum itself became timed, with specific subjects allotted their own rigid slots in the weekly schedule, much like different gears in a clockwork mechanism. Knowledge was no longer an endless frontier to be explored at one's own pace, but a structured system to be mastered within a fixed time frame. This mirrored the broader societal shift towards seeing the world itself as a complex machine, understandable through measurement and categorization, rather than a mysterious creation to be contemplated. The clock on the university tower was a constant reminder that even the life of the mind was to be regulated and made productive, its value measured in hours spent in study rather than in the depth of understanding achieved. This educational model served as a powerful engine for perpetuating the social hierarchies of the medieval world. The children of nobles and wealthy merchants, who were most likely to receive a formal education, were systematically trained to become the future managers of time, the abbots, magistrates, and guild masters who would wield the clock as a tool of control. Meanwhile, the vast majority of children who received no formal schooling or only basic instruction in a parish school were conditioned from birth to be the subjects of time, their lives destined to be measured and managed by others. Education, therefore, did not act as a great leveler. Instead, it used temporal discipline to solidify class distinctions, training one group to command the clock's authority and another to obey its demands without question. The lesson learned by the student was twofold. First, how to tell the time, and second, and far more importantly, to know his place in the timed society that awaited him. But to truly understand the power of the mechanical clock, we must first listen to the sound that dominated the medieval world for centuries before its invention, the deep, resonant toll of the church bell. This was the original time signal, a sound that carried across fields, over village roofs, and through the narrow streets of towns, weaving the daily lives of thousands into a single, coordinated tapestry. Long before anyone could glance at a clock face, everyone from the plowman in the field to the merchant in his stall understood the complex language of the bells. Their peals were not random noise, they were a sophisticated auditory code, a public address system that conveyed specific, urgent messages to an entire community. Primary rhythm of life was set by the ringing of the canonical hours, the 8 set times for prayer that structured the monastic day. The call to matins would pierce the pre-dawn darkness, a summons to the first prayers of the day. Prime marked the beginning of the workday around 6 in the morning, while none around 3 in the afternoon signaled that the working hours were drawing to a close. Compline, the final service of the day, was the official sound of nightfall, a directive for all good Christians to retreat to their homes and their rest. This schedule was the absolute backbone of medieval life, a relentless cycle of spiritual obligation that left little room for individual planning or deviation. Your entire day was orchestrated by this sacred soundtrack, yet the bells spoke a far more complex language than just the hours of prayer. They were the internet, the news alert, and the emergency broadcast system of the Middle Ages, all rolled into one. The sound of the bells would change dramatically depending on the message. A slow, solemn, and single tolling bell meant a death had occurred in the parish, and the age and status of the deceased could often be discerned by the specific pattern. A rapid, excited, and joyful pealing of all the bells announced a great festival like Easter or Christmas, or a celebratory event like a royal wedding or a military victory. Most urgently, the frantic, discordant clanging of the alarm bell, the tocsin, would set every heart racing, warning of fire, an approaching army, or some other imminent catastrophe. In an era of widespread illiteracy, these sonic signals were a universal language that everyone, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, was conditioned to understand and obey without question. This conditioning was profoundly effective because the bell's sound carried immense moral and spiritual weight. It was not merely a functional noise, it was considered the literal voice of God and the Church echoing through the earthly realm. To ignore the call to prayer was to sin, to turn a deaf ear to divine instruction. The bell was a constant memento mori, a reminder of one's mortality and the impending final judgment. This spiritual authority made the bell an incredibly powerful tool for behavioral control. It could quell a budding riot by reminding people of divine wrath, or it could stir a population to defense by framing a threat as an attack on Christendom itself. The Church, through its control of the belfry, held a monopoly on this powerful medium, making it the central nervous system of medieval society. The transition from this world of sound to the world of visual timekeeping represented a monumental shift in human consciousness. The mechanical clock did not invent temporal discipline. It inherited a system already perfected by the church bell. What the clock added was precision, autonomy, and a new kind of objectivity. A bell could call you to prayer, but a clock face could show you that you were 5 minutes late. The auditory signal was a command that required a response, but it was also transient. It faded into the air. The visual clock, with its moving hands, provided a continuous, silent, and omnipresent measure of time's passage, a constant visual pressure to be productive and punctual. It allowed for time to be segmented into ever smaller, more precise units that could be measured, bought, and sold. Ultimately, the great clock in the town square did not replace the church bell, it subsumed it. The bell was gradually integrated into the clock's mechanism, becoming its audio output, now rung by automated hammers instead of a zealous monk. This symbolized a broader transfer of authority from the ecclesiastical to the secular realm. Time was becoming civic time, merchant's time, and eventually industrial time. The deep roots of this control, however, stretched back through the centuries, nourished by the sound of the bell. The mechanical clock was not a revolutionary new invention of social control, but rather the evolution of an ancient idea, the refinement of the Church's auditory authority into a more precise, more powerful, Chinese letter, inescapable visual and mechanical enforcement. The clock tower was the direct descendant of the church belfry, and its silent, turning hands held all the authority of the bells that had come before. But our story of time and power is not one that belongs solely to Europe. While the mechanical clock was transforming medieval society in the West, other great civilizations were developing their own sophisticated timekeeping technologies, often with strikingly similar goals of regulation and control. Looking beyond the European experience reveals a fascinating truth. The desire to measure and manage time was a universal impulse among complex societies, though each culture imprinted its own unique philosophy and purpose upon the technology. From the bustling cities of the Islamic caliphates to the imperial courts of China, horology became a tool for asserting authority, though its form and function were beautifully diverse. In the vast and intellectually vibrant Islamic world, timekeeping was profoundly shaped by religion, yet seamlessly integrated into the machinery of the state. The faith requires devout Muslims to pray 5 times a day at specific intervals, determined by the sun's position. This religious obligation created an urgent need for precise astronomical observation and time measurement. Scholars in centers like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba responded with breathtaking ingenuity. They perfected the ancient water clock, or clepsydra, transforming it into monumental public marvels. These were not hidden away in palaces but were often displayed in city centers. Intricate automata figurines would mark the hours, and bells would sound the calls to prayer with a reliability that human muezzins could not always guarantee. But the true masterpiece of Islamic horology was the astrolabe. This portable brass computer, capable of calculating the time, mapping the stars, and determining prayer times, was a symbol of both piety and intellectual prowess. While these devices served the faithful, they were also potent tools for the caliph and his provincial governors. By standardizing the prayer schedule across the empire, they reinforced a unified Islamic identity and centralized religious authority. Furthermore, these timekeeping methods were essential for administering the vast caliphate, scheduling tax collections, organizing military campaigns, and regulating court proceedings. All ran on this sophisticated temporal framework, binding a diverse empire together with the consistent rhythm of measured time. Far to the east in China, the relationship between time and power took on a different, yet equally profound character. As early as the 8th century during the Tang dynasty, and later spectacularly under the Song dynasty, Chinese engineers created astronomical clock towers of staggering complexity. The most famous of these was built by the polymath Su Song in the 11th century. His water-powered clock tower stood over 30 feet tall, featuring a rotating armillary sphere for mapping celestial movements, and doors that opened on the hour to reveal mechanically animated figurines ringing bells and gongs. This was a technological achievement that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Yet, unlike in Europe, these magnificent machines were not primarily designed for public timekeeping or labor regulation. Their purpose was overwhelmingly symbolic and confined to the imperial court. The Chinese emperor was known as the Son of Heaven. His right to rule derived from the mandate of heaven, which was believed to be reflected in the perfect order of the cosmos. A clock that could accurately model the movements of the heavens was therefore not just a timekeeper, it was a powerful political prop. It demonstrated the emperor's unique role as the intermediary between the celestial and earthly realms, and his ability to maintain cosmic harmony. The clock was a symbol of imperial power and enlightenment, a dazzling display meant to impress foreign ambassadors and legitimize the dynasty's rule, rather than a tool for disciplining the daily lives of the common people. This crucial difference in application highlights why the European path proved so transformative. The Islamic world possessed the scientific knowledge, and China boasted mechanical marvels far earlier, but it was in the particular social and political landscape of medieval Europe that the mechanical clock found its most potent and widespread role as an enforcer of control. The key was scalability and integration into everyday life. The mechanical clock, particularly after the invention of the verge and foliot escapement, was relatively cheaper, easier to maintain, and more reliable in a colder climate than intricate water clocks. This allowed European towns to compete with one another in erecting these towers, spreading the technology rapidly beyond royal and religious circles and into the heart of civic governance. The clock became a public, communal, and inescapable fact of life for every social class, from the merchant to the serf. It was this democratization of timekeeping technology, paradoxically, that made it such an effective tool for social control on a mass scale. While the Chinese emperor kept time as a celestial secret and the Islamic caliph used it to unify religious practice, the European burgher, abbot, and king used it to micromanage economics, labor, and spirituality, weaving the clock's authority into the very fabric of society itself. Yet, just as the clock seemed to be weaving an unbreakable web of control, a catastrophe of unimaginable scale arrived to tear the very fabric of society apart. The Black Death swept across Europe in the middle of the 14th century, a tidal wave of suffering that wiped out perhaps half of the entire population. In the face of such overwhelming death, the meticulous schedules enforced by the clock suddenly seemed not just trivial but utterly absurd. The relentless tolling of the bell, once a command, now sounded like a hollow echo over silent, empty streets and fields left untended. The psychological impact was profound. The constant memento mori of the clock face was now dwarfed by the very real and immediate presence of mass mortality. For a brief, chaotic period, the rigid temporal order that authorities had worked so hard to impose simply shattered under the weight of the pandemic. This collapse of the old order created a strange and unprecedented window of opportunity for the survivors, particularly among the laboring classes. With so many workers dead, those who remained found their skills and muscle in desperately short supply. For the first time, they held a powerful bargaining chip. Peasants could abandon the fields of their traditional lords and flee to other manors offering significantly higher wages and better conditions. Skilled artisans in towns, now members of a much smaller guild, could demand premium pay for their work. There was a widespread rejection of the old, clock-driven discipline. Why work a rigid 12-hour day for a pittance when you could work a more flexible schedule for double the pay elsewhere? The feudal system, built on the fixed, timeless obligations of serfdom, began to crumble as workers exercised a newfound mobility and autonomy. The clock's authority, which had been so carefully constructed, was ignored by a population focused solely on survival and seizing a rare moment of leverage. The ruling elites, however, watched this social and economic revolution with absolute horror. The world was turning upside down, the lower orders were forgetting their place and, worse, profiting from the tragedy. Their response was not to adapt to the new reality, but to desperately try to reinstate the old one through brute legislative force. Across Europe, a series of repressive laws were passed, all designed to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels and force workers back into their traditional roles. The English government's Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the subsequent Statute of Labourers were among the most infamous examples, making it a crime to ask for or offer wages higher than those customary before the Black Death. But a law is useless without a means of enforcement, and this is where the clock was thrust into a new and more sinister role. Town councils and manor courts began to use public clocks as the objective arbiter for these new repressive measures. The clock provided the perfect, impartial evidence to prosecute workers. A landlord could now point to the town clock to prove that a laborer had not worked the full hours required by his contract, thus justifying withholding pay or imposing a fine. The precise start and end times of the workday, as measured by the clock, became legally binding, stripping away the fluidity that workers had briefly enjoyed. The clock's chime now signaled not just a time for prayer or commerce, but the moment when it was illegal to be paid more than a set amount for one's labor. This was a perversion of the clock's original purpose, transforming it from an instrument of order into a direct tool of economic suppression, its gears now grinding against the aspirations of the very people who had survived the worst disaster in human history. In the aftermath of the plague, the clock emerged not as a weakened symbol of a discredited old order, but paradoxically as a technology strengthened and its purpose hardened. The ruling classes saw in its mechanical, unwavering rhythm the perfect tool for restoring the hierarchy they feared was lost forever. They promoted the clock as a symbol of stability and a return to normalcy, a beacon of predictable order in a world that had descended into chaos. For a traumatized population, some of this message resonated. After years of uncertainty and death, the regular, reliable chime of the clock could provide a comforting sense that the world might finally be righting itself. This allowed authorities to frame their crackdown not as oppression, but as a necessary medicine for a sick society, with the clock as the precise measuring cup for the dose. The horrific experience of the Black Death, rather than ending the age of horological control, ultimately accelerated it, forging a powerful new link in the public mind between the ticking of the clock and the very survival of the social order itself. Beyond the town square and the monastery wall, the clock's influence extended into the very art that adorned the walls of churches, filled the pages of precious manuscripts, and hung in the halls of the powerful. Medieval artists, masters of visual storytelling, recognized the clock not just as a technological marvel, but as a profound symbol, and they wove its image into their work to convey complex messages about mortality, power, and the very nature of a well-ordered life. In an era where most of the population was illiterate, these visual narratives were a primary medium for shaping public consciousness, and the depiction of the clock within them served a crucial purpose: to make the new, imposed reality of mechanical time feel beautiful, inevitable, and right. Consider the vivid scenes found in illuminated manuscripts, those painstakingly crafted books that were among the most valuable objects in the medieval world. In the margins of a prayer book or a psalter, one might find a delicate rendering of a clock tower, its face clearly visible, overseeing a scene of peasants harvesting wheat or merchants trading in a market. This was not a mere decorative flourish. By placing the clock within idealized scenes of daily labor and commerce, the artist was creating a powerful visual argument. It suggested that this mechanical regulation was an intrinsic, harmonious part of the natural and social order, that the clock's authority was as benign and necessary as the sun shining on the fields. It helped naturalize a radical new concept by framing it within a familiar, even bucolic context, softening the edges of control with the brushstrokes of artistry. This symbolism became even more potent and explicit in the large-scale art of church frescoes and stained glass windows. Here, the clock was frequently paired with the most powerful moral and religious themes of the age. A common motif was the Last Judgment, where Christ sits in majesty, separating the saved from the damned. Artists began to include clocks in these scenes, often held by angels or placed prominently in the architecture of heaven. This created a direct, terrifying link between timekeeping and divine judgment. The clock became a measure not just of hours, but of one's moral worth. Its moving hands counted down the moments one had left to achieve salvation. In the Dance of Death, another popular theme, a skeleton representing death often carries a timepiece, sometimes politely offering it to a shocked king or pope. This was the ultimate memento mori, a reminder that time runs out for everyone, regardless of earthly status, and that the clock's ultimate authority was death itself. These images used fear and awe to reinforce the clock's power, equating punctuality with piety and wastefulness with sin. It is vital to remember that the artists creating these works were not free agents expressing personal vision. They were skilled craftsmen working under a system of patronage. A monk illuminating a manuscript was doing so for his monastery. A painter creating a fresco for a cathedral was being paid by the church chapter. An artisan designing a tapestry was fulfilling a commission for a noble lord. Their survival depended on pleasing their patrons, and their patrons were the very institutions, the church, the nobility, the wealthy merchant guilds, that were using clocks to enforce their authority. Therefore, their art was inevitably shaped to glorify that authority. The clock was depicted not as a tool of oppression, but as a symbol of wisdom, order, and divine favor. A tapestry in a lord's hall showing a magnificent clock above a peaceful, productive town was not just a pretty picture, it was a piece of propaganda, justifying the lord's rule by portraying his control over time as a benevolent force that brought prosperity and harmony to all. Through this widespread artistic dissemination, the clock transcended its function as a mere machine. It was elevated into a potent cultural symbol, its image saturated with meaning. It stood for the rationality and order that the emerging modern state claimed to represent. It represented the unyielding justice of God and the futility of worldly vanity. It symbolized the power of the patron who could afford to own such a complex device and commission art celebrating it. This cultural absorption was perhaps the most sophisticated form of enforcement, because it moved beyond compelling action to shaping belief itself. People were taught not just to obey the clock, but to venerate it, to see its presence in art and in life as a mark of civilization and divine will. The gears and hands of the clock were no longer just iron and brass. They were woven into the very ideology of the age, making the regulation of time feel less like an imposition from above and more like a fundamental, even beautiful, truth about the universe. The relentless tick of the medieval clock did not fade away with the end of the Middle Ages. Instead, its rhythm was absorbed into the very heartbeat of the modern world, becoming so familiar we often forget it was ever imposed upon us. That foundational idea, that time is a resource to be measured, managed, and monetized, is perhaps the most profound and enduring legacy of this period. Before the mechanical clock, time was a context for life, the natural backdrop against which events unfolded. After it, time became a container to be filled, a quantity to be optimized. This shift in perception laid the absolute groundwork for the entire capitalist economic system. The medieval landlord demanding a precise number of hours from his serfs was the direct forerunner of the industrialist who paid workers by the shift, and the modern corporation that budgets every project down to the billable minute. The phrase, "time is money," famously coined by Benjamin Franklin, is not a timeless truth of human nature. It is the direct ideological descendant of the economic logic first enforced by manorial courts and guild masters using the town clock as their ultimate arbiter. This legacy is physically embedded in our environment, in the very architecture of our daily existence. Walk into any classroom or office in the world, and you will see the direct inheritance of the monastic horarium. The school bell that segments a child's day into periods for math, history, and science is the secular echo of the cathedral bell calling monks to prayer, designed to instill the same habits of punctuality and obedience to an external schedule. The modern office, with its 9-to-5 structure, mandatory lunch breaks, and precisely tracked hours, is the intellectual descendant of the guild workshop, where the clock on the wall ensured standardized output and prevented any individual from deviating from the collective norm. We have internalized this discipline so completely that we now wear the technology of enforcement on our wrists and carry it in our pockets, constantly monitoring ourselves, feeling a pang of anxiety if we are late or a sense of virtue if we are productive with our time. We have become our own abbots and overseers, policing our own schedules with a severity that would impress a medieval guild master. The clock tower has also evolved, its form changing but its function of control remaining strikingly consistent. The factory whistle of the Industrial Revolution was simply a louder, more shrill version of the monastic bell, herding masses of workers instead of monks. Today, that function has become both more subtle and more pervasive. The digital calendar notification, the time-tracking software on your work computer, the algorithm that measures a delivery driver's speed and a warehouse picker's efficiency, these are the direct heirs to the mechanical clock. They represent the culmination of a centuries-long project to render time ever more precise, measurable, and enforceable. This digital panopticon offers efficiency and convenience, but it also continues the ancient tradition of using timekeeping to monitor, discipline, and extract maximum value from human activity. The medieval desire to make the flow of time visible and controllable has now reached its zenith, with every click, keystroke, and moment of inactivity potentially subject to analysis and judgment. Understanding this deep historical roots allows us to see our contemporary hustle culture and obsession with productivity not as a modern invention, but as the latest chapter in a very old story. The pressure to optimize every waking moment, to never waste time, to constantly be striving and achieving, this is not a natural state of being. It is a cultural framework, a set of values that was carefully constructed over centuries, beginning with the Church's equation of idleness with sin, and perfected by industrialists who saw human beings as components in a machine. When we feel overwhelmed by the tyranny of the clock, we are not failing personally. We are bumping up against a system of control that has been refined for hundreds of years to make us feel that way. Recognizing this history is the first step toward reclaiming a more humane relationship with time. It allows us to ask critical questions: who benefits from this constant urgency? Is this endless efficiency truly enriching our lives, or is it simply making us more anxious and less free? The medieval clock was a tool for enforcing a specific social order, and by examining its origins, we can begin to discern the outlines of the social order our own timekeeping practices are enforcing today. It's a comforting and pervasive image, the medieval era as a time of simple, natural rhythms, where life moved to the gentle, unhurried pace of the seasons and the sun. We often romanticize this period as an idyllic escape from our own clock-driven anxiety, a world before deadlines and time cards, where people lived in harmony with the environment rather than fighting against it. This nostalgic vision, however, is a profound misconception that obscures a much more complex and compelling reality. The truth is, the Middle Ages were not a pre-technological paradise free from temporal pressure. They were the very crucible where our modern, regimented relationship with time was first forged, not for the benefit of the common person, but as a sophisticated tool for their control. A particularly stubborn myth suggests that the mechanical clock was universally welcomed as a benevolent bringer of order and progress. The narrative goes that these marvelous machines simply helped everyone coordinate their lives more efficiently, creating peaceful, synchronized communities. But this ignores the overwhelming evidence of resistance. The adoption of clock time was not a peaceful transition. It was often a top-down imposition met with grumbling, subversion, and sometimes outright defiance. Workers whose lives had previously been measured by the completion of tasks finishing a row of planting, weaving a length of cloth, now found themselves subjected to the abstract and relentless tyranny of the hour. They responded with the same ingenious passive resistance that laborers have always employed. They worked slower, they feigned misunderstanding of the new schedules, and they clung to older, natural time signals like the sun's position or the behavior of animals. Folk songs and stories from the period are filled with characters who outwit the clock-watching overseer, celebrating a cunning intelligence that valued life and leisure over blind obedience to a mechanical master. This was not a society embracing efficiency. It was a population being disciplined by it, often against its will. Furthermore, the idea that clocks were purely beneficial ignores the fundamental question: beneficial for whom? The answer, clearly, was for those already in positions of authority. The lord who could now demand a precise number of hours of labor from his serfs, the abbot who could enforce perfect attendance at prayers, the wealthy guild master who could standardize his workers' output. These were the true beneficiaries of horological precision. The clock did not create order in a vacuum. It created a specific kind of order designed to consolidate power, increase economic productivity for elites, and reinforce social hierarchies. It was a technology that served the interests of the monastery, the manor house, and the merchant's guild long before it served the field hand or the apprentice. To see the clock as a neutral, benevolent invention is to ignore the political and economic power structures it was built to sustain and strengthen. Perhaps the most important myth to dismantle is the notion of the clock as a neutral tool. We often fall into the trap of technological determinism, the idea that a technology's impact is inherent in its design, inevitable and unbiased, but a clock, like any technology, is not neutral. Its very design embodied a worldview, that time is linear, uniform, and divisible into abstract, equal units. This was a radical departure from the fluid, task-oriented, and natural rhythms it replaced. More importantly, its implementation was deeply political. Who owned the clock, who had access to it, who interpreted its signals? The answer was always the same: the institutions of power. The clock was built by artisans paid by the church or the town council, housed in a locked tower only they could access, and its time was declared to be the one true time for everyone beneath it. This wasn't neutrality, it was the monopolization of a fundamental human experience. By controlling the definition of time itself, authorities could make their preferred social structure appear as natural and immutable as the laws of physics. Debunking these romanticized misconceptions is not just an academic exercise. It allows us to see the clock for what it truly was: a political instrument, one of the most subtle and effective ever devised. It shaped medieval society not through overt force, but by reshaping the very consciousness of its people, training them to think in terms of obedience to an artificial rhythm. Understanding this history is crucial because it shatters the illusion that our own technologies are neutral. It draws a direct line from the medieval clock tower to the digital algorithms that now manage our productivity, track our locations, and measure our social engagement. These, too, are often presented as purely beneficial tools for efficiency and connection, yet they are deeply embedded in modern structures of power, commerce, and control. By examining the hidden mechanisms of the first clocks, we gain a critical lens through which to view the technologies that dominate our lives today, reminding us to always ask the essential question: who truly benefits when a new tool claims to tell us how to live? From the solemn cells of monasteries to the bustling squares of growing towns, the story of the medieval clock is a powerful reminder that the technologies we create are never truly neutral. They are born from the values and ambitions of their time, and they, in turn, shape the world in their image. We've seen how this intricate dance of brass and iron was far more than a mechanical marvel. It was a deliberate instrument of power. Its chimes did not merely mark the hours, they commanded them, orchestrating the rhythms of prayer, labor, and commerce to serve the interests of kings, abbots, and guild masters. This was a silent conquest, not of land but of consciousness, training millions of people to internalize a new, regimented way of experiencing life itself. Yet, for all its imposing authority, the clock's control was never total. The human spirit, with its deep-seated need for autonomy and community, consistently found ways to push back. From the strategic slowdown of workers to the preservation of ancient, alternative festivals that operated on nature's time, people carved out pockets of freedom. They whispered jokes about lazy peasants who outsmarted their clock-watching masters, preserving a subversive wisdom that valued life over productivity. This resistance is a crucial part of the story, reminding us that the imposition of order from above is always a negotiation, never a foregone conclusion. It is a testament to the enduring desire to reclaim time as a shared human experience rather than a managed resource. And what of the legacy of these medieval timepieces? It is all around us, woven so seamlessly into the fabric of our modern lives that we scarcely notice its origins. The very notion that time is money, the 9-to-5 workday, the relentless tracking of productivity on our digital devices, these are not natural laws of human existence. They are the direct descendants of the economic logic first enforced by manorial courts and guild halls using the town clock as their unchallengeable witness. We have become the monks in the monastery of modern capitalism, diligently policing our own schedules, feeling anxiety over wasted minutes and virtue in our efficiency, all while wearing the technology of enforcement on our wrists. But understanding this deep and often hidden history gives us a precious gift, the power of perspective. When we look at the clock on our wall or the calendar on our screen, we can choose to see not just a tool but a story, a centuries-old narrative about control, resistance, and the ongoing struggle to define how we live our lives. This knowledge allows us to ask critical questions of our own time. Who benefits from our constant urgency? Is this endless optimization truly enriching our lives, or is it making us more anxious and less connected to each other? By seeing the clock as a historical artifact with a political past, we can begin to disentangle ourselves from its most oppressive rhythms. Perhaps then we can start to imagine a different relationship with time. One that makes room for meandering conversations, for spontaneous laughter, for staring at the clouds without a single thought of productivity. One that values depth of experience over the sheer quantity of tasks completed. The medieval clock taught us to see time as a commodity to be spent. Maybe now, armed with the lessons of history, we can learn to see it once more as a garden to be tended, a gift to be shared, and a source of community rather than control. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If these hidden histories have changed how you see your present, consider subscribing for our next exploration into the forces that have quietly shaped our world.